morning, beautiful and creative people. I'm delighted to be here to share my personal story and how I came to the field of preservation. Because in the end, preservation really is about people and it's about stories. So I'm from a little place called Paducah, Kentucky. Anybody heard of Paducah? Little small town in the western part of Kentucky. I grew up in a black neighborhood, got a twin brother, younger sister, and as I look back at my understanding of the historic built environment, we used to play this game where we would drive down Jefferson Avenue and we would point out our favorite historic house. That's the house I'm gonna live in. You ever play that game? So when I was in elementary school, my mom, as a professional development opportunity, would ask me and my brother to go up when we were registering for school and introduce ourselves. I went up to the administrator and I said, "Good morning, my name is Brent Leggs." She said, "What's your address?" I said, 741 McGuire Avenue. She said, "What apartment number?" And I said, 741. And I'm noticing my mom getting irritated. We lived on this long street, and in 1972, my parents built their first home, a red brick style ranch house that they were very proud of. I started to understand that race, place, and identity and the lack of cultural competency could begin to create and shape my own identity. Years later, I started to understand that preservation was happening on an informal basis. Every time we would be at church and they'd take up that second offering to raise some more money to restore the roof on the historic church building, or every time we went to the family farm for our version of Juneteenth, and we would take time to mow the grass at the family cemetery, that was a form of culture conservation. But years later, I would go to the University of Kentucky. I get an undergrad degree in marketing, an MBA, and I started the process of searching for my professional identity. Corporate America didn't seem right. And so I learned that there was a furniture making program in the School of Architecture at the University of Kentucky. And I was like, I found it. I can use my hands and my art and creativity and make furniture for people. But I would end up having this 15-minute random conversation with Dr. Dennis Domer, who was the Dean of the Graduate Preservation Program. It really represents the power of random conversations. He told me I'd be the first African American to go into the preservation program, first person with an MBA, and because I was interested in real estate development, kind of loft conversion was on trend at the time. In his words, I could make a shitload of money. So I was sold. A few months later, I was learning architectural history, Ionic columns and Gothic columns, and I questioned that decision. But thankfully, they had me to conduct the statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools in my home state of Kentucky. Rosenwald Schools represents a massive school building program that was envisioned by Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee University and funded by philanthropist Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the second president of Sears and Roebuck. Together, they helped to fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. During this year-and-a-half long research project, I learned that my mom and dad attended Rosenwald schools. And I remember being at a school that looked similar to this and having this multi-sensory experience with this place. I walked inside this often forgotten and abandoned building. I could hear the creaking floorboards. I could see, I could touch, I could smell the mold and mildew. But I started to realize that there was this quiet power to preservation, a transcendent quality. That Booker T. Washington's vision uplifting the Black community was real and ongoing and had directly impacted my own life through my parents attending Rosenwald schools. Preservation makes Washington and Rosenwald's life, once lived, real. It removes the gap between space and time, unlike any other form of history. There is power in preservation. There's also power in monuments that are used to create cultural crises in our nation. In 2017 and 18, 3 cultural moments that has inspired the creation of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. Charleston, Mother Emanuel. Charlottesville, Thomas Jefferson Memorial. The African Meeting House, Nantucket. These are examples where culture, heritage, and public spaces collided in the most violent and derogatory way. We want to showcase that preservation is a solution for responding to this social challenge in our nation, that preservation can drive social innovation and positive change in communities across our country. But we also realize that those actions of white nationalists on the march in polo shirts, trying to create a new form of Jim Crow, is rooted in a legacy of slavery. We have a social responsibility to preserve these places, to never forget who we are. Places like Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia, second largest slaveholding site in the United States. If you walk downtown today, this is what you see. Concrete, pavement, cars, urban development from the 1960s. But masked under all of this is an archaeological site, Lumpkin Slave Jail, an African burial ground. We ask ourselves, how do we preserve history, heritage, memory, when the physical evidence is no longer visible? But this community has their own vision for memorialization and commemoration of slavery. It's a beautiful idea, and one that is more appropriate for that sacred space. Anybody heard of the father of the Constitution? James Madison's house in Virginia. Imagine driving this majestic and beautiful landscape as you go down these winding roads and these beautiful lawns. You'll see in the distance this Georgian-style house that is standing there to greet you. Today, when you experience this landscape, you forget that this was a former plantation. There's a real contradiction in someone creating the founding documents of our nation, but not considering all people and people that look like me and you. What's beautiful about this is we sat around the reconstructed slave dwellings, calling the ancestors to honor the enslaved workers at this plantation. And we sat around this fire with descendants from this plantation, honoring their memory. President Woodrow Wilson's house in Washington, D.C., staunch segregationist. Literally, the public policies that were implemented under his administration are still negatively impacting us today, all of us. Who would imagine that Black people would want to be inside a space like this in DuPont, inside this beautiful historic home? We thought it was an opportunity to reclaim this space and to tell a fuller narrative about this experience. We worked with artists, high school students that composed a new composition and song that highlighted the Black DC protest movement during the civil rights movement here in this city. Look at this. Playing at his own piano. At the National Trust, we are passionate about telling the full history of our nation. But we believe we have a responsibility to elevate the full contributions of African Americans to our nation. In essence, we want to reconstruct national identity. We want to rewrite history. And we want to do that by preserving sites of activism, achievement, architecture, community, and beyond. Places like Hinchliffe Stadium in Paterson, New Jersey. Anybody heard of Larry Doby? Second African American to integrate Major League Baseball just 3 months after Jackie Robinson. He's been forgotten in American history, but this is his home field. It also hosted professional Negro League Baseball for 12 years, the Newark Eagles, the New York Black Yankees, and the New York Cubans. If you experience this site today, you would pass the Great Falls of Paterson, this beautiful cultural landscape, and above it, you will see this 20-year vacant, massive concrete building that holds this remarkable and beautiful history. Today, it has been preserved and protected in perpetuity. Anybody heard of Joe Frazier? Two-time heavyweight champion of the world, a gold medalist in the Olympics. At his gym in Philadelphia that he owned for nearly 4 decades is where he trained for his iconic bouts against legendary Muhammad Ali. Unfortunately, he lost this property in 2011, right before he passed away. Today, if you experience the building where his name is etched in the stone on the front facade, you'll walk inside to a discount furniture store. How ironic in a city like Philadelphia that has a statue honoring a fictional hero. We didn't think that was a fitting tribute, so we have worked with partners to protect the gym in perpetuity, and hoping that buys time to be able to find a reuse strategy for honoring Joe Frazier. We got anybody here from whoop whoop? The Harvard of HBCUs right here in Washington, D.C. Who would know that the law school was once housed inside this historic building that was designed by a pioneering Black architect, Albert Cursell? Inside these walls is where Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall and others devised a legal strategy to desegregate America's public schools. It's also inside these walls where Ta-Nehisi Coates was inspired to write his first novel after reading James Baldwin's A Fire Next Time. You imagine the stories that this place could tell. And can you imagine of the 105 HBCUs, the historic buildings and landscapes that they steward, how special and important, and they must be preserved. Anybody heard of Pauli Murray? I hadn't heard of Pauli Murray until about 3 years ago. Come to find out that Pauli Murray was raised in this simple house in Durham, North Carolina. First African-American Episcopal saint, co-founder of the National Organization of Women. Thurgood Marshall referred to her legal research as the Bible of civil rights law. She's a early social justice advocate and champion, and if you don't know her, you should. Anybody from Chicago? Chicago has a beautiful history, a story of the outmigration of African Americans from the South to the city and to a neighborhood in the south side of Chicago, Bronzeville. This space is where Black artists could express their art and creativity and feel safe. The preservation of this site links together culture, art, and preservation as a tool for community revitalization and economic development. And they're celebrating this year their 75th anniversary. Claiborne Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. We've all seen this iconic graphic design and posters during the Sanitation Workers' March in the 1960s. Literally, this is where Dr. King had his final stance before his assassination. We're working not only to preserve this story of Black activism, but also the historic building of Claiborne Temple. And this is one of my favorite stories and places. In Irvington, New York, is an elegant historic residence that embodies the optimism and perseverance of American entrepreneurship. This is the beloved home of Madam C.J. Walker, America's first self-made female millionaire. And I hope y'all heard that. America's first, not Black, America's first self-made female millionaire. She created a hair formula and product to help Black women's hair grow and be healthy. She would train and employ 23,000 sales agents in the US and Caribbean. She did all of this before women had the right to vote. She would integrate the most expensive zip code in the United States in Irvington, build this mansion on the same street as Jay Gould's Lyndhurst, arguably the most significant Gothic revival architecture in America, and 3 miles from the Rockefeller Estate, Kykuit. I think we ought to celebrate the power of women. Designed by Vertner Tandy, the first licensed Black architect in the state of New York, co-founder of Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Look at this. The furniture in here is not original, but all of the architectural details, the integrity is significant. Wouldn't you want to get married here? So the property has just been acquired by Richelieu Dennis, who is the founder of New Voices, a $100 million fund. This space will be reimagined as a think tank for women of color and entrepreneurs. It's got a bright future ahead of it. Birmingham. Imagine seeing this historic space. It doesn't look like much. But once you start to realize the history that's embedded in these walls, that room up here in the corner, second level, historically room 30, is where Dr. King, Reverend Shuttlesworth, Reverend Abernathy, foot soldiers, A.G. Gaston, and many others would plan and implement the Birmingham campaign called Project C. Inside that building is where Black men, women, and children tested and affirmed the timeless idea that purposeful collective action can change our nation and the world. This right here is an image on May 10th, 1963, where they ended the mass protest movement, changed local and national public policy to the benefit of all of us. Sixteenth Street Baptist Church. right down the street from the A.G. Gaston Motel. We know the story in September 1963 where 4 black girls were murdered because of the system of Jim Crow and racism. We wanted to remind the Birmingham community of the history that they steward, and so we hired Lettucey, a soul artist. We had a high school marching band, and we marched around this cultural district. And they passed 16th Street, the Gaston Motel, the Masonic Temple designed by Robert Taylor, America's first academically trained licensed black architect. This building itself was designed by Rayfield Wallace. They also passed the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, designed by the second generation black architect, Max Bond. No other cultural landscape in our nation has that kind of historic buildings. Today, the Gaston Motel is the centerpiece of a civil rights national monument. And my last example is the childhood home of legendary activist and jazz musician, Miss Nina Simone. Anybody heard of Nina Simone? What is so beautiful about this place is most African American historic sites are simple, unadorned places that at first glance don't seem to hold a lot of meaning or significance. But once you start to pull back the layers and uncover that this is a space that birthed a jazz legend that would use her voice, unlike any other artist, to confront racism in America. We're working with a group of 4 New York City-based visual artists that, as a form of politics and activism, created an LLC when the property was in foreclosure a year ago. And they are helping us to reimagine how we program and reuse this historic space. As creatives, how would you think about honoring Simone's life and legacy through art, music, creativity, and more? Adam Pendleton. So who's going to be the next Adam? Who's going to be the next Rich Dennis Liu? Who's going to be the next Madam C.J. Walker? Or Nina Simone? Or A.G. Gaston? We all have a responsibility to tell the truth about who we are as a nation. When we do that, we begin to relate to one another better. We see our humanity in each other. Preservation isn't your grandma's or grandfather's preservation. It's no longer about honoring white industrialists or former presidents or wealthy farmers. It is about telling an inclusive and diverse story about our nation. The African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, $25 million preservation and fundraising campaign. It's the largest ever undertaken on behalf of African American historic places by a nonprofit organization. We are changing the American narrative. We are changing the profession of preservation. And most importantly, our aspiration is to ensure that all Americans see themselves and their history and their potential in the African American historic places that surround us. Thank you so much.